In August 7, 1942, exactly 8 months after Pearl Harbor, American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in the southern Solomon Islands as the first step on the long road to Tokyo. The Japanese reacted violently. They elected to have it out right there, to stop the Allied recovery right at the start and at all costs. Down from their mighty base at Rabaul, they sent reinforcements and supplies through a sea lane flanked by 2 parallel rows of islands in the Solomons archipelago. The sea lane quickly became known as the slot, and the supply ships, usually fast destroyers, became known as the Tokyo Express. The night runs of the Tokyo Express were wearing down the Marines. As they became more and more dirty and tired, they became more and more irritated to find that the Japanese they killed were dressed in spruce new uniforms, a sure sign that they were newcomers to the island. Even worse was the sleep-robbing uproar of the nightly naval bombardments that pounded planes and installations at Henderson Field, on Guadalcanal, the only American base where friendly fighters and bombers could find a home. The American hold on the island was in danger from sheer physical fatigue. The American and Japanese fleets clashed in the waters around the Guadalcanal landing beaches in a series of bloody surface battles that devoured ships and men on both sides in a hideous contest of attrition. Whichever side could hang on 15 seconds longer than the other, whichever side could stand to lose one more ship and one more sailor, was going to win. At the very moment of one of the big cruiser-destroyer clashes, October 11 to 12, 1942, officially called the Battle of Cape Esperance, American naval reinforcements of a sort arrived in the area. 40 miles east of the battle, 4 fresh, unbloodied fighting ships were sailing into Tulagi Harbor at Florida Island, just across a narrow strait from Guadalcanal. It was half of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, 4 PT boats, the first American torpedo boats to arrive in combat waters since the last boat of Lieutenant John Bulkeley's disbanded Squadron 3 had been burned in the Philippines 7 months before. The PT sailors came topside as they entered the harbor to watch the flash of cannonading in the sky to the west, where American and Japanese sailors were blowing each other to bloody bits. For them, training time was over, the shooting time was now, and the PT Navy was once again on the firing line. All day on October 13th, the PT sailors scurried about, getting the little warships ready for a fight. Their preparations made only a ripple in the maelstrom of activity around the islands. Coast watchers, friendly observers, who hid on islands behind the Japanese lines and reported by radio on ship and plane movements, reported a new menace to Guadalcanal. They had spotted a Japanese naval force coming down the slot, but they said it was made up only of destroyers. When Lieutenant Commander Alan R. Montgomery, the PT squadron commander at Tulagi, heard that only destroyers were coming, he backed off from the fight, on the extraordinary grounds that he preferred waiting for bigger game. Montgomery's decision is not as cocky as it first sounds. The Japanese, presumably, did not know about the arrival of the PTs on the scene. And if ever a PT was going to shoot a torpedo into a big one, a cruiser or a battleship, it was going to be by surprise. No use tipping off the enemy until the big chance came. The big chance was really on the way. The coast watchers had underestimated the size of the Japanese force. It was actually built around a pair of battleships, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, all bent on pounding Henderson Field and its pesky planes out of existence. The Japanese command obviously expected no American naval resistance, because ammunition hoists of the Japanese fleet were loaded with a new kind of thin-skinned shell, especially designed for blowing up into jagged fragments that would slice planes and people to useless shreds. The bombardment shells would not be much use against armor. The Japanese ammunition load would have been a disaster for the task force if it had run into armored opposition, cruisers or battleships of the American Navy. But the Japanese knew as well as we did that there was little likelihood our badly mauled fleet, manned by exhausted sailors, would be anywhere near the scene. The Japanese sailed down the slot, with one hand voluntarily tied behind them, in a sense, supremely confident that they could pound Henderson Field, without interference. Shortly after midnight on October 14th, 2 Japanese battleships opened up on Henderson Field, with gigantic 14-inch rifles shooting the special fragmentation and incendiary shells. The 2 battleships were accompanied by a cruiser and other 8 or 9 destroyers. A Japanese scouting plane dropped flares to make the shooting easier. An American searchlight at Lunga Point, on Guadalcanal, probed over the water, looking for the Japanese. But American 5-inch guns, the largest American guns ashore, were too short of range to reach the battleships and cruisers, even if the searchlight had found them. The big ships hove to and poured in a merciless cascade of explosives. For almost an hour and a half, Marines, soldiers, and Seabees lay in foxholes and suffered, while the Cyclopean, 14 inches, tore holes in the field, riddled planes with shell fragments, started fires, and filled the air with shards from exploding shell casings, shards that could slice a man in two without even changing the pitch of his screams. At the PT base in Tulagi, Lieutenant Commander Montgomery was awakened by the din across the way. He knew that no destroyer force could make that kind of uproar. The earth-shaking cannonading meant that the big boys were shooting up Guadalcanal, blithely assuming that the U.S. Navy was not present. But it was. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 was on the scene and waiting for just such a target. Montgomery called in his 4 young skippers, Lieutenant Henry S. Stilley Taylor of PT-46, Robert C. Walk of PT-48, John M. Searles of PT-60, and his brother Robert Searles of PT-38. At 2 o'clock in the morning of October 14th, Commander Montgomery ordered, "Prepare for action. All boats under way immediately." It was the first combat order given to PT boats since the debacle in the Philippines. The PTs left the harbor together but scattered quickly. They had all spotted the Japanese bombardment fleet by the orange flashes of its guns, and they lost each other in the darkness as they deployed to attack. Somebody on a Japanese cruiser must have been at least mildly nervous, for a searchlight came on, swept the water toward Tulagi, zipped right across Bob Searles in 38, and then went black. Searles stretched his luck. He cut his speed to 10 knots and began a slow stalk of the cruiser that had muffed its chance to sound the alarm. So cocky were the Japanese that the cruiser was almost dead in the water. Even at 10 knots, the 38 closed the range from behind. Bob Searles greased the 38 along the still waters of the Sound, holding his breath and dreading to see the glare of that searchlight again. He could see the target clearly silhouetted in the gun flashes, and it was a brute, a light cruiser. Bob thought, judging from its shape, its size, and the roar of its guns, Searles figured that he would probably be the first and only PT skipper to enjoy the carefully preserved surprise that the PT sailors hoped would bag them a big one. So he had to make his first shot good, or waste the chance they had all been hoarding. A torpedo, like any other weapon that has to be aimed, is more likely to hit the closer you get to your target before you shoot. So Bob went into 400 yards in stealthy silence. 400 yards in a naval battle is the equivalent of arm's length in an infantry firefight. At 400 yards, a spread of torpedoes will usually score, but the machine guns and auto-cannon of a cruiser's secondary battery, guided by a searchlight, will almost certainly tear up a torpedo boat. Searles, just to be sure of a hit, was doing the same thing as a commando would do. If armed with a high-powered rifle, he crept to within 5 feet of a sentry armed with a sawed-off shotgun. At any range, that rifle is a deadly weapon, like a torpedo. But at close range, the shotgun is just as deadly and 10 times sure of hitting with the first shot. At 400 yards, Bob fired 2 fish. He chased along behind them to 200-yard range, almost rock-throwing range, and fired his last 2 torpedoes. The instant he felt the boat jump from those shots, he poured on the coal and roared past the cruiser, 100 yards astern. As they went by, all hands topside on the PT felt the scorching blast of a double explosion forward of the cruiser's bridge. The surprise was over. From here on in, the whole Japanese task force would be alarmed and shooting back. But that big boy the PT sailors had been after was in the bag. The 38's crew was sure of it. Searles had the good sense not to hang around the hornet's nest he had stirred up. His torpedoes were gone anyhow. so he hit out for home, convinced that he had scored the first PT victory of the comeback trail. The other PTs had scattered, looking for other targets in the dark. There were plenty of targets, for they had penetrated the destroyer screen, without either side knowing it, and were in the heart of the Japanese formation. After the blast from the 38's torpedo attack on the cruiser, the PTs themselves were as much targets as they were hunters. Lieutenant Commander Montgomery, riding with John Searles on the 60, was stalking a big ship, possibly the same cruiser Bob Searles had already attacked, but the escorting destroyers were roiled up and rallying around. A searchlight poked about the water, looking for the 60, which had probably been dimly spotted by a lookout. The searchlight never found the 60, but it did silhouette the PT for another destroyer. Japanese shells from the second destroyer screamed over the PT, but Montgomery held steadily to his attack course on the cruiser, or whatever it was, until two of the 60's fish were off and running. John Searles spun the rudder over hard left and shoved the throttles up to the stops. Smoke poured from the generator on the stern to cover their escape, and so the crew of the 60 didn't see the end of the torpedo run, but it claimed a hit. Anyhow, from the sound of a massive explosion. If it was a torpedo hit, and if the hit was on the same cruiser Bob Searles said he hit, that cruiser was in sad shape. Not so the destroyers. They were full of fight and boring in on the 60. Smoke makes a fine screen for covering escape, but only for a time. After the initial escape is successful, a continuing smoke cloud only marks the course of the fleeing PT boat. Just as a tracer's phosphorescent trail tracks a bullet through the night, so Montgomery shut off the smoke when he thought they were free. But he had waited a moment too long. Just as the smoke screen generator hissed to a halt, a destroyer pinned the 60 down in the blue glare of a searchlight, and a salvo of Japanese shells, landing 20 feet astern, almost lifted the 60 out of the water. The Japanese destroyer captain did not know it, probably still doesn't know it if he is even alive. But when he turned his light on the 60, he simultaneously lost the chance to sink one PT boat by ramming, and just possibly saved his own ship from being sunk by still another PT. Robert Walk's 48 was sleeking up on the destroyer, in a torpedo attack on one side. Henry Taylor's 46 was roaring across the water, looking for targets on the other side, quite unaware that the destroyer was in its path. When the searchlight glare hit the 60, Taylor saw the Japanese ship dead ahead and put the rudder of the 46 over hard. He barely missed a collision with the can, a collision that would have reduced his little warship to a floating carpet of matchsticks. But, in skimming by the destroyer, Taylor almost rammed Walk's 48 and spoiled its torpedo attack. Walk lost contact with the destroyer, in the wild careering around the sound that followed the double near collision, and he didn't get off his torpedoes. The whole time the Japanese captain was so intent on sinking the 60, pinned down by his searchlight, he apparently missed the near collisions right under his nose. His shells were creeping up the wake of the fleeting 60, and he doggedly plowed into the stream of 50 caliber bullets from the PT anti-aircraft machine gun battery, willing to take the punishment in exchange for a chance to run the torpedo boat down. Lieutenant Commander Montgomery turned on the smoke generator again and had the inspiration to drop 2 depth charges into his wake. The charges exploded just ahead of the Japanese destroyer, and the Japanese skipper shied away from the chase, fearful that the closer he got to the PT boat, the more likely he was to be blown in two by a depth charge right under the bridge. The 60 escaped in the smoke, lay close to the beach for the rest of that night, and drifted aground on a coral reef near morning. Walk, who had picked up his original target again, was still trying to shoot a fish into the destroyer that had abandoned the chase of the 60. Walk did not know it, but he was himself being stalked. From 200 yards away, a Japanese destroyer caught the 48 in a searchlight beam and fired all the guns that would bear. A searchlight beam is a two-edged tool. It helps the aim of the gunners on the destroyer. At the same time, it makes a beautiful mark for the PT's machine guns. C. Todd, the ship's cook, pumped 50 caliber bullets into the destroyer's bridge and superstructure until the light was shattered. The destroyer disappeared, and nobody knows what damage it suffered, but it is highly improbable that it could be raked by .50 caliber fire from 200 yards away, without serious damage and casualties. The 48 skipper could say, "He never laid a glove on me." Aboard the Japanese flagship, the admiral, apparently alarmed by unexpected naval resistance, no matter how puny, ordered a ceasefire and a withdrawal. The 80 minutes of shell fire had left Henderson Field in a shambles anyhow. Forever after, Guadalcanal veterans of the night between October 13th and 14th, 1942, talked about the bombardment, not the bombardment of this date, or the bombardment of that date. Simply the bombardment. Everybody knew which one they meant. What had the PTs accomplished on their first sortie? Bob and John Searles claimed solid hits on a cruiser. Post-war assessment of the claims says that there is no conclusive evidence that any major Japanese ship was sunk on that night, but the next day a coast watcher reported that natives had seen a large warship sink off the New Georgia coast to the north on the withdrawal route. Radio Tokyo itself acknowledged the loss of a cruiser that night, under the attack of 19 torpedo boats, of which we destroyed 14. That last bit, public admission by the Japanese of the loss of a cruiser to a PT, is the most convincing. The Japanese played down their own losses ridiculously. Sometimes they even believed their own propaganda, so much so that they deployed for battle forces which had been destroyed, but whose loss they had never admitted, even to themselves. A curious incident during the almost nightly naval bombardments of Henderson Field shows the Japanese sailor's fatal desire to believe his own propaganda. 8 Japanese destroyers and a light cruiser bombarded the field the night of October 25, 1942. They sank 2 small ships, but they called off the shore bombardment after only a feeble effort. The reason? A Japanese officer ashore had sent a message. Banzai. Occupied airfield at 2300 hours. He had done no such thing. Indeed, the very planes spared by that spurious message sank the cruiser the next morning. Perhaps a more important result of the first PT foray than the hit on a cruiser was the shock to the Japanese nervous system. The Japanese Navy had an inordinate horror of torpedo boats, possibly because the Japanese themselves were so diabolically good at surface torpedo attack. The knowledge that American torpedo boats were back on the scene must have been a jolt to their sensitivities. Nobody can prove that the Japanese admiral called off the bombardment because of the torpedo attacks. After all, he had already shot up Henderson Field for 80 minutes and had expended almost all his special bombardment ammunition. But it is a remarkable coincidence that the shooting stopped almost immediately after the PTs arrived, and the withdrawal followed soon after the torpedoes started swimming around. Half an hour after their sortie from Tulagi, the PTs saw a vast armada of Japanese ships turn tail and leave the field to them. The Marines didn't quibble. They crawled out of their foxholes, those who could, and thanked God for whoever had run off the 14 inches. Henderson Field had survived, but barely, and the Marines were willing to give anybody credit for running off the battleships, if whoever it was would just keep them off. The PTs were willing to try. The night between October 14th and 15th was the low point of the Navy's contribution to the Guadalcanal campaign. 2 Japanese cruisers insolently pounded Henderson Field with 752 8-inch shells, and the Navy could not lift a finger to stop them. The only Navy fighting ships in the area were the 4 PTs of Squadron 3, but the 60 was still aground on a reef. The 38 had left all of its torpedoes inside a Japanese cruiser the night before, and the other 2 PTs were escorting 2 little supply ships across the channel between Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The cruisers had a field day. The next night 2 Japanese cruisers fired 100,500 punishing 8-inch shells at Henderson Field. The Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, in Washington, after studying the battle report, could say only, "Everybody hopes we can hang on." Admiral Chester Nimitz was even more grim. "It now appears that we are unable to control the sea in the Guadalcanal area. Thus our supply of the positions will only be done at great expense to us. The situation is not hopeless. but it is certainly critical. Perhaps the PTs had arrived too late to do any good. Certainly a navy that consisted of 3 torpedo boats afloat and 1 on a reef was not going to win the battle for Guadalcanal.